Wargaming has been a part of Western militaries and wider society for over 200 years. It is routinely used for research and analysis of new concepts and capabilities. Faced with a growing array of asymmetric and ill-defined threats, strategists and think tanks have turned to wargaming in the hopes of outthinking future adversaries. As a result, wargaming has enjoyed a renaissance in the corridors of power in recent years. Senior officers have openly praised the utility of wargaming, including VCDS, who stated he wished to reinvigorate wargaming in defence. However, this is not the picture throughout the hierarchy. Wargaming is largely a niche or specialist activity, and wargames are seen as large, expensive, and complicated events that are the preserve of the experts from dedicated organisations. Professional instruction and accreditation in wargaming is rare, and few militaries dedicate a career stream, even when combined with wider synthetic simulation. Identifying oneself as a wargamer in the military risks incurring a stigma: nerd, geek, Dungeons and Dragons, take your pick of insult. This belies the huge positives wargaming can offer militaries via training and education at comparatively little cost. Challenge remains how to get the benefits to the mainstream by making wargaming for the many and not just the few. The panel tonight are military. We're proud to welcome Professor Philip Sabin, formerly of King's College London, Ivor Gardner, former commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Regiment, and Tom Mowat, lead for simulation modelling at the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom. Their bios were circulated in advance of the webinar, so I will not regurgitate their impressive accomplishments. Suffice to say, they have all designed, facilitated, and umpired many wargames in their time, and more appropriate to tonight's conversation, they've also taught others how to wargame. Gentlemen, you are most welcome. Our first panelist is Professor Phil Sabin, formerly of King's College London, author of the book shown there, Simulating War, and on a personal note, taught me around a decade ago in his Master's Conflict Simulation module. Phil, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Ed, thanks very much, and let me know if you can't hear me. Anybody? Right. As you can see there, my book, Simulating War, we'll come back to that. Next slide, please. Next. Ed, can you hear me? Right. Okay.
Yes, good. Do you want me to go back, Phil?
No, that's fine. That's fine. There just seems to be a bit of delay in the transmission. Yes, go back to the previous one.
Yeah, there you
go. Okay, thank you. Clausewitz, which I'm not sure you're seeing this. Right, Clausewitz.
Yeah, we've got it.
Clausewitz made a comparison, as you can see, of war to a Kartenspiel, a game of cards. And very quickly, next slide, please. Very quickly, that coincidental resemblance between war and games was exploited by his Prussian army in the development of the Kriegspiel, and you can see what the Chief of Staff said about that when he saw it demonstrated. Next slide, please. Armies around the world built on that over the next 150 years or so, and there you can see some examples of war games being used for military education purposes primarily in that period. Next slide, please. From about the 1950s, wargamers were the first to jump on the computer revolution, even when it was fairly low tech, as you can see there on the left. And for many, this completely outdated the old technology of board games. What's interesting is that recently, in the last 10 years or so, military board gaming has had something of a revival. And I think a clear reason for that is that however good computers may be, it's very hard for non-programmers to tweak or design their own war games in computerized form, whereas, as we shall see, it's very easy for them to modify or design manual board game type games. So there's still merit in the old technology. Next slide, please. There are really two key components to war games, illustrated here by the classic game of chess. One is the potential capabilities embodied in forces in a particular theatre of war, but the other is decisions made by the opponents or players representing them about what to do, without which there would be no game of chess or there would be no war. So those two components, capabilities and decisions, are equally important. Next slide, please. It seems to me that wargaming is only really useful in situations which are characterized by dilemmas and trade-offs. Here's a very simple game that I designed initially and that Ed has modified for use with Fight Club indeed. And the dilemmas that this explores are concentration versus dispersion, fire versus maneuver, and the balance between those. So any war game needs really to focus on the difficult decisions. If it's clear what to do, you don't really need a war game to explore it. The beauty of wargaming is when there are trade-offs and dilemmas which make it uncertain what the best course of action is. Next slide, please. There are two big distinctions within wargames. The first and most important is between those with rigid rules, like the one on the left, and those with no rules, like the one with Tom, as you can see on the right. Both were used for Sandhurst training. The one on the left, as you can see, has the hexagons and rules to accompany it, like a game of chess. Very early in the development of wargaming, Kriegspiel had a variant which was called Free Kriegspiel, where the rules don't exist except in the minds of the players and particularly the umpire. Computer wargames, by their nature, have to be rigid. But manual wargames can be anywhere on the spectrum from the fully rigid, codified, as in chess, through to completely free play. And that's, I think, the most important distinction within this. My specialism has tended to be on the rigid side. Others, like Tom or Ed McGrady in the States, focus more on the free play. Next slide, please. The other distinction is between hidden information and open information. Chess is a game with open information. Kriegspiel initially, and in many variants still to the present, has hidden information. You see there a playtest of an initial version of the Camberley Kriegspiel, which Ivor will talk about shortly. And the characteristic feature here is that the players only see their own forces and what the umpire in the middle reports to them about what the other side is doing. So it's very much blind man's buff. Next slide, please. Clausewitz said that war was the province of chance and uncertainty. And there's a reason he said that it was like a game of cards rather than chess, which doesn't have those features. Dice are a very good, simple way of introducing uncertainty into wargaming, but people don't tend to like them, especially in professional contexts. They think it turns the game into a game of Ludo. They're wrong, but it is an important issue which needs to be addressed. One advantage of a hidden war game is, like the ones that you can see there, the very simple ones that I've designed, you can actually use the hidden nature of it and the guessing that that necessarily involves as a means of injecting randomness, you guessed well or badly, without needing dice. In open games, it's much more difficult to include realistic chance and uncertainty without some form of random number generation, which people will often see makes it a game of luck rather than skill. Next slide, please. Next to the designer, the role of the umpire is absolutely paramount. Obviously, in free games, the umpire has to be there because it's really only in their head that any conflicts will be resolved and the rules will be generated. Even in rigid games, especially when used in a teaching context, as you can see here, umpires play a vital role in interpreting the rules for the players who are not experts in the application of the rules, nor is that the point of the exercise. Umpires also provide you a force multiplication possibility. As you can see here, here's a game that I designed, but we have 6 umpires running it for my undergraduate students. When I tried to run this game in the early days just once for a class of this size, it was a disaster because 90% of the people were completely unengaged because, of course, they had no chance of taking a real part in the decisions. You need to have, for wargaming, enough games to allow people to have a part to play, and umpires or the group of umpires can be vital in that. Next slide, please. Simplicity is wonderful in wargaming if you can achieve it. One of the great advantages of simplicity is there is less demand on the player to learn the overhead of rules. A simple, rigid game, which the players can understand for themselves, will allow them to play one another in multiple contests without even needing an umpire on each table. You see there are 2 instances in which I've run a very simple game about the First World War with groups of up to 100. Even with hidden information using a screen and the battleships type mechanic. And that's only possible when you have a game sufficiently simple to allow it. Next slide, please. The downside of simplicity is it can be simplistic. Let's take the issue of force ratios. It's often thought you need a 3-to-1 ratio of attacker to defender to succeed in the attack. That's actually only one factor. Equally important is force density. This is from my book, Simulating War. It shows 2 examples in both of which the attacker has 3 times the forces of the defenders. But as you can see, the relative fighting power on the y-axis varies hugely depending on whether it's a low force density for both or a high force density for both. And many simple war games or simplistic war games don't allow for that and therefore don't recognize the full nuance which affects real combat. Next slide, please. An inescapable artificiality of wargaming is nobody really dies. That's a good thing, but if you're trying to simulate a violent, dangerous conflict, the risk is, of course, that you'll get into the Call of Duty syndrome where you get these heroes simply needing to lie down behind a wall to recover after taking any kind of hit. Computer games, including the BBS system, with everybody represented by an avatar, have problems with this. And it's actually easier, as you can see on the left, to program in the observed caution and self-preservation instinct of troops when you are representing them top down by counters on a map, because you can rule, as in this game, which again adapted for use by Fight Club type organizations, you can rule that they take cover whether or not the player wants them to do so when they're under fire. Next slide, please. It's important to validate wargaming to make sure that it does represent at least the essentials of the combat that you're trying to simulate. Here's an example of that. It's in my old office at King's College. It's the Rapid Campaign Analysis toolset developed for DSTL. And it's a historical validation exercise based on the Falklands. And some of you may recognize Julian Thompson and Mike Clapp, 2 of the key amphibious commanders, brought in specifically to tell us whether it was realistic or not. Next slide, please. It's important to take advantage of cross-national experience because there's lots of important developments that are taking place in other countries and we can learn from them. You see there are examples from Europe and the States. The top left, Johan Elg, is one of my PhD students and actually did his PhD on the use of wargaming by armies in various countries and comparing and contrasting that experience. So let's learn from one another. Next slide, please. As you heard from Ed, I taught a course for many years, I no longer do because I'm retired, on how to teach wargame design. And here you can see some of the students in that. The main lesson I drew from that is that unless they actually play games, multiple games, people will not get it. You can't learn how to design a war game just by learning some theory or reading my book or whatever. You have to actually try and play the games. That's why hobby gamers have such an advantage, because they're routinely in their spare time playing games for fun. Next slide, please. And to come up to the issue of Zoom and so on, you wouldn't even be hearing from me now if it weren't for Zoom, because I'm speaking to you from Chile. On the other hand, my experience with trying to run games online has suggested to me that it's very much a second best compared to my preferable alternative, which is to run them, as you saw, in person. In my experience, running games over the internet takes twice as long, and we're already seeing something of that with the delays with the communication here in just this simple talk. But also, it has problems of resolution. It's much easier for people to get an overview of the battle and zoom in onto the details on an in-person map than it is on the internet. And I had real problems with that running a course for Moors just a few months ago. So to my mind, Zoom is by no means the best way to run war games. Next slide, please. And finally, just to leave you with some links and some books and so on, or recent books, including my own, that have come out. There's a tremendous amount of valuable content in there. And the two websites that I recommend there have enormous amounts of resources. So please go and use those and you'll be much better informed. Right, thanks very much for that. And I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Phil. And just to reassure everyone that Phil is coming from Chile, so if there was a delay or a lag, we shouldn't be experiencing that all the way through the presentation. And if anyone's in doubt, my submission from 2010 did not make it into Phil's slide as the best in breed. So thank you. I think we are, oh no, we do have a question already. Okay, so Alex W. Asked, Mr. Sabin, thank you for your presentation. How are students of the UK Defence Academy Sandhurst or other UK military courses taught in wargaming?
I'll defer that if I may, because the other two presenters are much more able to answer that. I gave you a couple of examples of how they have been in the past. The problem, I think, is trying to make it stick. Unless you have somebody on the faculty all the time, other priorities tend to come in. War games are hard for non-experts to run, so unless you've got someone who's keeping them there and running them effectively, they can tend to die out. But I'll leave that very much to my colleagues, especially Tom.
Okay. Phil, I'm conscious that you're the sort of civilian academic on the panel, so I think it would be remiss if I didn't sort of focus on some of the educational benefits that you've found from wargaming versus the sort of military training and rehearsal of sort of operational activities. So in your experience, what have been the benefits of using wargaming to teach military history or indeed other forms of academic curriculum?
Yeah, I focus for today, given the audience, on my experience with military audiences and contemporary gaming. My focus in King's has been on teaching military history, as you say. Wargaming is very good, I think, to give people a sense of the tactical and strategic dynamics of a past conflict. Excuse me, learning wargame design, we similarly focus on the historical context, mainly because we know what happened. And it's easier to design a game when you know what happened, because then you can play the game, see if it goes right, or more likely see where it goes wrong, and then you can correct the game. Designing a game on modern conflict or future conflict, you don't know. The whole point of the game may be to decide what might happen, but you have no reality check, you have no validation. That's why, as you saw, we used the Falklands even for a game like ARCAT that was focused on designing for the future. So I found wargaming very, very useful as a means of teaching military history for its own sake. The challenge, as I said, is you don't have time and you don't want people to be getting bogged down by the minutiae of the rules, and therefore the role of these teaching assistants, typically my MA students, who will come along and run the game for the BAs, allows them to experience the game without getting too bogged down in learning the rules.
Yes, and I'll just keep talking since we're currently in a bit of a drought for questions on this one. Other professors in military colleges have also commented that when using war games, they've managed to sort of get the students more immersed in the setting of the problem, to understand the sort of point of view from the participants, whether that be a faction, a player, or an army. Have you had any sort of like sound bites? Because I'm conscious we're going to talk about training and education in the military context further on. And one of the key nuggets I want to sort of pull out from this webinar is that learning is improved through the sort of kinesthetic practice and visualization of what's going on. So if you could just speak to that briefly, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. I remember once we were running a contract for RAF Hendon, I think it was, and the training objectives said, we need you to cover Western European Union, NATO, and a whole laundry list of things in a half-hour lecture. And I said, well, it's very, very difficult to do that. But then I saw the training advisor at the back, and all you needed to do was mention Western European Union in your lecture, and he ticked it off. Well, the people haven't actually learnt anything about it, you see. What war games do is they take longer, but they actually provide a more in-depth understanding. You never forget being defeated in a war game. You never forget the balancing of objectives and so on that you have to do in order to do well in a war game. A lecture, on the other hand, like this one indeed, people can tune out. They very rarely will retain much from it, certainly not in the level of detail that is being provided. So war games give this in-depth understanding, but the cost of that is that they do take longer and they're harder to deliver. One can deliver a lecture to 200 people. Delivering war games in which 200 people are playing is very, very much harder. But I would argue it's worth the effort, not as a replacement for lectures and reading and so on, but as a complement to them.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's going to be a theme touched on by our other panelists as well, the challenges of replacing a traditional method, or augmenting a traditional method, I should say, with some form of wargame or conflict simulation, setting it all up and then validating that it worked and then repeating it. And with that in mind, there is a question here from, apologies if I say this wrong, from Boot, who's asked, how have after action reviews, evaluations informed or shaped your wargame design going forward? And could you share a specific example?
It's really important to see the effects of the wargame from the perspective of the players, because this isn't an indulgence for us, okay? Militaries are best at doing this because they, in all the activities they do, they have the validation, they have the surveys and the like. We have them also in civilian academia, and everything that I've seen from the students suggests that the majority, and it's never all, the majority really like the war games. They want more war games. My MA students, for example, the reason why we put more and more war games into the course, in the MA course, rather than me talking about how to design war games, is because they said we need more war games. So there's a very clear example that they are finding the kinesthetic immersion really important. They don't learn just by being talked at, okay? But it's vitally important that we do learn from those sorts of reviews. We need to be better, and there is now, particularly at King's College in the Wargaming Network, a colleague of mine, Aggie Hurst, who is looking very much, not as a wargamer herself, at student surveys to see what they're actually getting from this. It's not necessarily the wargamers who are the best at eliciting this, because they have an axe to grind. So wargamers can be complemented by academics and others who are looking dispassionately at what works and what doesn't in terms of wargaming. Wargamers can be too enthusiastic and can come across as such, and that can be counterproductive.
Thanks. And I'm just going to pick one more before moving on to our next panelist. So Abdul Salim asks, how do you ensure balance and fair play for the opposing players when designing the wargame? I just add to that. There can often be a sort of gamification aspect whereby we should have equal forces, or we should both be able to enjoy playing a wargame against each other. And one of the fascinating sort of comparisons I would use is saying that the famous quote that if you're in a fair fight, you haven't planned the operation effectively. So coming to the fight with overwhelming odds, or a better strategy, better kit, etc., is absolutely the asymmetric fight we want to plan for. But equally, it's not a great game situation to play through. So how have you sort of squared that circle?
Right. There are two aspects to this. One, in terms of fair play, you do of course want people not to cheat, and that's why letting people apply the rules for themselves, and you saw the game where they had the screen between them. It will be possible for people to cheat. One hopes in that case that they will be deterred from doing so just by their own sense of honor and so on. In real war, you want to cheat. You want people to be cheating and breaking the rules. And one of the interesting things of free play games is people can say, I want to do this, which nobody has thought of before, and then the umpire on the fly has to decide whether it's likely to work or not. But you don't want to encourage people to always play by the rules, given that in real world they can win by not doing so. Balance is a much easier thing. Just as in golf, you handicap. The most asymmetric situation can be made into a balanced game by handicapping. I'm better at chess than you. Fine, I'll play without a queen, or without a queen and rooks. Okay, that sort of principle I have a much better force than you. Fine, I need to win much better than you do in order to get a game victory. So the balance is easy to work out. There's a game, for example, about the Persian Gulf War in 1991, where you have hundreds of units as the Allies, and you're playing against the solitaire system representing the Iraqis. You lose it if you lose a single unit. Of course, you're going to take Iraq or Kuwait, but if you lose a single unit, you've actually done worse than history, and therefore you lose the game. That balances the game without making an artificial contest in which the Iraqis can throw you out of Saudi Arabia. Okay?
Great. Phil, thanks very much. If anyone has remaining questions unanswered, please store them up for the Q&A at the end. So our next panelist is Ivor Gardner, now retired, formerly commanding officer, 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Regiment. So Ivor is different to Phil in the sense that he was a hobby wargamer initially, but then decided to supercharge his military career and his pastime, and use wargaming to instruct his junior officers, not shown in this photo, to improve their understanding of military concepts, and also how to fight his battalion more effectively in the field. Ivor, over to you.
Thank you, Ed. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to start by embarrassing you and blowing a bit of smoke up your backside, just to say what a fantastic job I think you're doing driving this UK Fight Club initiative forward. And also a very quick happy Thanksgiving to any of our American friends out there. Right, my wargaming journey, if you like, has been probably more intuitive than academic. And what I want to do is share a little bit my own viewpoints and experiences with you, how I've used it as a tool for conceptual development. I started wargaming at the age of 13, cut my teeth on squad leader and panzer leader, and that was about the same time I realized I wanted to follow a military career. As an infantry platoon commander in the South African Defence Force 1988 and 91, I found the planning process that we use, the military decision-making processes, came very easily and intuitively to me, and so did the tactical thinking. I never joined the dots at this stage to wargaming. At Sandhurst, once again, I found that the estimate process that we did, the decision-making, was not a challenge. A lot of people really struggled with it. Again, I found it fairly intuitive. Now, I'd spent a lot of time at university between armies, wargaming as a hobby again, Squad Leader and Advanced Third Reich, both fairly complicated games. So my perspective here really is that wargaming has given me a significant leg up when it came to military planning and thinking. And the logical carryover for that really is that if wargaming could see me better prepared for a military career, for the planning and the decision-making that comes with it, then surely it could serve as a tool for developing and practicing my young officers. And my biggest surprise upon joining the British Army, where I thought I'd find a lot of like-minded people, is that there was almost a discouragement factor about wargaming, as if it was a rather nerdy undertaking, and that it was really not the done thing for professional officers to talk tactics in the mess. Now, you would argue that surely anybody who's interested in a professional military career, who's responsible for decisions that directly place lives in harm's way, you would think that they would be interested in every aspect of that profession. Frankly, when somebody's taking pot shots at me in some foreign field, I want the guy who's in charge of me and telling me what to do to approach this whole business with a somewhat serious intent rather than just seeing it as a bit of a hobby. So that was my surprise. And I think in the Army that the conceptual development part of the three pillars is the one that gets the least attention. So why wargame? My view on it is it allows you to practice your basic tools of your trade, your 7 questions, to apply and understand your doctrine, to execute plans, understand concepts, learn to adapt as you go along, to have a live thinking adversary who forces you to adapt and change your plans, to learn lessons as you go along and then get to apply them. There's a training and development piece that comes with it with no real costs or overheads. There is the understanding of what it is to lose. And again, that comes at no cost other than pride, because it is neither a tactical exercise without troops, nor a course of action war game. And I think those are quite important delineations, and maybe we can tease those out a little bit in Q&A. And also for pure enjoyment, there's an adversarial competitive element to it, which is fun. Let's face it, most of us probably enjoy wargaming while we're here. So my intent now is to provide a bit of a narrative going through and to add some flesh to the skeleton viewpoints I've just given here. And I hope some of you might challenge me on those at the end of this, because they are purely that. They are my perceptions, and some of you may disagree or have. Oh, sorry, next slide, please, Ed. There is a little bit of a time lag. So I'll talk on while we wait for the slides to change. Right, you might recognize that as from an advanced squad leader map. The first proper chance I got to wargame and develop officers was my platoon commanders when I was a rifle company commander. And I used advanced squad leader, not the simplest of games. It certainly wouldn't meet Phil Sabin's requirements for something simple in the slightest, but it worked. 2 of my young officers went off to become top of their JOTAC courses, and on the tactics and planning side anyway. And my company second in command successfully went off and navigated his way through the planning festival, that is SAS Officers Week selection, and completed the rest of selection. As a battalion second in command, I then had an opportunity to use it again, and really that was for preparing for battlefield studies. I took one to Monte Cassino, and we used Monte Cassino Simple Magazine Wargame for that. At headquarters DSF, I saw it being used by DSTL, and really there it was as a tool to assist with capability gap assessments. So it was being used as a force development and capability development tool. And then finally, as a commanding officer, I got to really use it properly as a tool for conceptual development. Again, I used advanced squad leader because it was something I was familiar with. It was easy for me to get across. And what I'm going to show you here is an example of one of the engagements between some of my young officers, the most senior of which was a captain. They were using our 7 questions process. They had to use our doctrine. They got to conduct their planning. They would then back brief me, the battalion second in command, and their company commanders. And then they would have an opportunity in the mess over a beer to execute their plans against each other. Again, applying our doctrine and our execution. The cost of the unit was £20 for a boxed game of advanced squad leader starter kit, so peanuts. And we actually took that with us on exercises. So all you needed was a table. You could set it up. You didn't need software experts. You didn't need electricity. You didn't need laptops, computers. It was easily done. And this is a snapshot of just one of those, with Americans advancing into Aachen in 1945. And you can see there some of the key deductions that they were making on the side. Next slide, please, Ed. The next picture shows an intent schematic drawn up, and that would be recognizable to any army officer, I think, in any army. Next slide, please. So the initial plans, really for the Americans, this was a company group plus fighting into the outskirts of Aachen to seize a toehold, if you like, with a platoon, well, a company minus of Germans, I suppose, in defense. And the Americans had decided that they wanted to achieve their break-in in the center and have two flanking forces off to left and right to secure their flanks. The German primary defensive position, their vital ground, was seen as being in the center, and they had some mutual support out on the flanks and a little bit of depth. The main lessons that were taken away from this were depth and mutual support in defense, failure to exploit, failure to adapt, and the effective use of reserves. Next slide, please, Ed. And very briefly, what happened is the Americans achieved unintended success on the right flank. They managed to break the small German post there. On the left flank, they merely had a holding and supporting position, and in the center, where they wanted to achieve the break-in, they became somewhat fixed. The lessons learned and applied here by both sides was positions of depth and mutual support. So covering each other's flanks, covering across each other's frontages. The next one, next slide, please, Ed. What the next slide shows you here is the Americans then making a fatal decision. They had achieved a breakthrough on their right flank, but they actually failed to exploit it. Because their plan had said, we will achieve a breakthrough in the middle, they pulled their forces from the right flank and threw them into the center where they'd become fixed. So what happened is they remained fixed in the center, and they lacked the strength and the resources to be able to outflank the Germans on their left flank and get round behind them. And the outcome of this was that the Germans won. So the Germans made very effective use of reserves here. The Americans had failed to adapt, and they'd failed to seize that opportunity to exploit. They were too rigid in their thinking, no contingency planning. So what? Well, in the audience, when this was presented to the first Army Wargaming Symposium at Shrivenham, was the commanding officer of Cast North, and he asked the question, who did this for these young officers? The company commanders must have had a hand in this. And I pointed out to them it was all down to their own work, all their own efforts, including the planning. And his commentary of that is that he had had battle groups coming through Cast that were less effective in their planning than these young officers. So, you know, we were starting to see the impact that this was having on their understanding. And within the unit, we established leads. Every company second in command was responsible for rolling it out as at company level. And at battle group headquarters level, we used the intelligence officer, the operations officer, and the training officer. Any of our officers that were going off on professional courses, we ran through a process of wargaming. And those who went off to the captain's warfare course came top of their courses for the tactics and the planning side, including our regimental administrative officer, who was not from a T-THOM, and she came top of her syndicate. So, you know, we were seeing real evidence of the efficacy and the effectiveness of using it. And again, when we played these games through, the young officers in the mess were understanding their doctrine. They were having tactical discussions in the mess. They were becoming very comfortable with the planning tools. And all of this was free of having directing staff peering over their shoulders and marking their every move. So the pressure was gone from it as well. And now we did make other use of wargaming within One Royal Irish. Next slide, please, Ed. Because I had seen how effective it could be in bringing a battlefield study to life, what I did at Casino as a battalion second in command, we did at Leros and in the Ardennes with the battle group headquarters. What I would get is split the officers who were attending into two sides. One would plan from the Axis, one from the Allies. They would then execute those plans against each other, and then we would go off and do the battlefield study on the ground. In fact, for the Ardennes offensive, we were at that point in time transitioning to become the first light mechanized battle group in the British Army. So what we did was we followed the route of Kampfgruppe Piper, going to the Ardennes in December to understand all of the challenges that he faced in trying to maneuver heavy vehicles through that terrain and in those weather conditions. And that actually helped inform the conceptual development we had in hand for the for light mech. So our officers deployed on these battlefield studies with a deep understanding of it, of the organization, of the units, of the terrain that they were going to be fighting over, and also of the issues and challenges that had faced the commanders on the day. And it brought the battlefield studies to life and significantly enhanced the levels of enjoyment that came with them. Now, we spent a year re-rolling from air assault to light mechanized. There was no doctrine in place yet for light mech. we did all that conceptual development as a battalion, and I used wargaming to underpin a lot of the decision making that we did, a lot of what influenced that, the outcomes of it. And the outcome was a radically different rollout of light mech in the army from what Army Headquarters' initial thinking had been. As for urban operations, I wish urban operations had existed when I was a commanding officer. I think it's a fantastic design from a French army officer who ran the urban training center at Senzab for a while, and it really brilliantly captures, I think, modern tactics. Next slide, please. So the Camberley Kriegspiel, not something I used at unit level. This is something, original concept by Phil Sabin. And then I spent 2 years rehabilitating at the Defence Medical Rehab Center. And I volunteered for a task. I was given this to try and turn that into something that would be a training tool for Army officers at battle group and brigade level. That's no criticism of Phil. He's a genius at this sort of stuff, but its original existence wasn't quite suited to what we wanted to get out of a tool for battle group planning and brigade planning. So I spent those 2 years designing, developing, testing, and training, trialing it with various units. The basis really was merging my hobby wargaming experiences into something that I felt as a commanding officer would be an invaluable tool for me to prepare people going either on exercises or operations using 1:50,000 maps, our own doctrine and operational staff work processes, some of which you can see here. It needed also to align with our thinking and with the staff officer's handbook. Critically, it had to pass the Army officer credibility test. Army officers with no wargaming experience who think they know wargaming because of course of action wargaming, which is not one and the same thing. Next slide, please, Ed. I'm going to rattle through these quickly. That's an example of overlay for a 1:50,000 map of Sennybridge, which is one of the scenarios was set. That's showing both sides control measures and their NAIs and TAIs drawn onto the map. There's a picture of, it's a double blind, you know, so what you're seeing there is from the red perspective where they still don't entirely know what the blue forces look like yet. So there are generic counters representing blue. And finally, I think the proof of the pudding is always in the eating. So I trialed it with many units, many training establishments, and I selected this endorsement from 2 Para because I felt it really epitomized what I was trying to achieve with the Camberley Kriegspiel. Those of you who know paratroopers, sorry, thanks, Ed. If you can get a paratrooper to appreciate something requiring a little bit of brain power, then you've reached a desirable end state. So, questions. Will wargaming make you a better leader of soldiers and a better officer? Probably, I can't really argue that it would definitively. However, will wargaming enable you to practice planning, give you a deeper understanding of your doctrine and its application, and likely contribute to you being a better officer with a better understanding of and being better practiced in your profession? I'm not going to answer that. I'll throw that out there and leave that to you to mull it over. You'll have your own thoughts on it. And I'll leave it to you. I welcome any questions. Ed, thank you.
Ivor, thanks very much. I'm just going to take ourselves to our question slide. And we're going to go with Steve, who's asked, if there was one thing you could change to improve the acceptance and use of wargaming at unit and subunit level, what would it be?
It's got to be done more, Steve. Thanks for that question. It's a good one. This was a frustration I had throughout my military career, and it still hasn't been adequately resolved. It has to have top-down drivers. So it's got to have buy-in from 2, 3, 4-star level. They have to make it an imperative. They have to show willing, and they have to drive it downwards without turning it into part of the whole military secretariat process. Units have got to see that it's being supported from the top and delivered accordingly. However, the real enthusiasm and the drivers that will take it forward, I think, are going to come from the young officers. So it has to be introduced to them at Sandhurst level and then driven forward incrementally as they go on through their career, helping them to become better prepared and helping them to understand how simple wargaming can make them better officers, can make the tools of their trade more amenable and familiar to them as they go along, and ultimately, you know, improve all of their outputs. Certainly, that's my personal thinking, because the way it was being done when I was still there is scattered handfuls of enthusiasts would drive it within their unit, but as soon as they leave, it leaves with them. it'll fade out over a very short period of time.
Ivor, I just want to put it to you that the British Army still got a bit of a sort of feudal approach to commanding officers and their authority, and your battalion benefited because when you were in that position, you decreed that this was going to be part, and I'm sure you sold it to people and they understood, but it isn't the case across the board. And one of the frictions and challenges of getting wargaming embedded is that the senior officer of the day or multiple senior officers of the day may not be particularly enamored to it, and therefore that is the first and final stumbling block. Do you have any sort of comments on that?
Oh, how do we get around that? Again, it has to be something, I think the important thing for me when I was rolling it out is that it was always to be done in training time. So not eating away the time of young officers, because then they've got too little time ready anyway. And also it was not de-essed. So for those of you who don't know what I mean, there was no directing staff involved in it. This wasn't part of your proficiency report, your annual report and all the rest of it. So the pressure was removed from it. So the enthusiasm could build up in the young officers. They could, in fact, the best thing I ever saw was when the platoon sergeants and corporals in one of the rifle companies started seeing their platoon commanders doing this, and then they wanted in because they saw this as an opportunity for them to prove that they could plan and execute better against their officers as platoon sergeants. That competitive element was driving it. The enthusiasm was there. Young officers were going off from captain's warfare courses, coming top of their courses, and people could see the benefit that they were getting from wargaming. How do we get the drive and the buy-in from senior officers? Because I lost the train of your question a little bit, Ed, so forgive me if I'm rambling, but because I saw it time and again where a senior officer was appointed to make sure wargaming happened without really necessarily having the interest themselves, or thinking that they knew wargaming because we all do COA wargaming, right? So we all know how to wargame, and it's a completely different thing altogether. This is about developing wargaming as a tool to develop young officers for conceptual development, for understanding, making them better officers, and helping them along their promotional course as well. So they've got to see the benefit of that, and they also have to see that it's being properly supported at senior levels. Time is being allowed, allowances being made for time to be given to it. I always said to my company commanders, I am not going to pass or fail you if you do badly in a war game. I'm not going to put any pressure on you, but what I will do is I will ask questions if I see that you're not providing it as part of the conceptual development of your younger officers. So that level of pressure to drive it from the more senior levels up. But I think if it gains traction at the Sandhurst level upwards, it'll grow apace. It'll develop a momentum of its own.
Okay, I'm just going to do one more, and this is from Ian. Do you have a preference for tabletop / map-driven / analog wargaming versus electronic media? And if so, what are the advantages?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to give an example there of why I favor clearly tabletop and map-driven type scenarios. I know computer gaming is taking off. A lot of youngsters out there now are playing really interactive computer games. And in fact, the systems that we're using in the Army are somewhat behind what the guys are playing on Xboxes and whatever other tools that they're using. So I've seen guys using virtual battlefield trainers where actually they're not as immersed in it because they get better when they're back in their rooms in the lines. The other thing is, when I first joined the British Army and we used to run command and staff trainers, they had massive map layouts where people were walking around in barefoot, moving counters around, and all of the units that were involved in it were sitting around the side and they could see it, and it was immersive. People were immersed in what was going on. If you're sitting behind a computer screen, I tend to find one person becomes immersed, and that's the person behind the screen. And if you're the 4 or 5 others who are involved in it sitting around, it's very easy to become distracted. I found it over the last 10 months with Zoom calls and Skype calls and all the rest of it. I'm speaking for myself. My own attention isn't fixed as firmly as it is if you're sitting around a map and everybody's involved. If you stick a computer screen up in an officer's mess with something on it, maybe 1 or 2 people are going to have a look at it. If you stick a map down an officer's mess table with a couple of counters on it, it'll be like flies around the proverbial. They all want to come and see what's going on. And if you start talking tactics, then they've all got an opinion and it involves people. So I have a preference for those. I think the advantage is the immersion factor and the fact it's a lot cheaper. You just need to haul out a map, any map, You don't need all sorts of interfaces, and the power's not going to fail on you.
Great, Ivor, thanks very much. There are more questions coming in, but we'll save those for the Q&A. So thank you for your contribution.
Thank you, Ed.
Okay, our final panelist is Tom Mowat, still serving. He is currently SO2 Simulation and Modelling at the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom. We crossed paths when he came as a guest lecturer to Phil's conflict simulation module when I was but a wee young'un, and we continue to cross paths on all things simulation in the capability and acquisition world. Tom is going to take a slightly different direction from the two you've just heard, and is going to talk about wargaming in the professional training curriculum. Just a word of warning, he's very well travelled and will be able to tell you many stories of his exploits of wargaming around the world. So if you don't get hold of him, it's probably because he's off jetting around somewhere to show another country one of the wargames he has developed. Tom, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ed. I'm not likely to be heading off on any travels soon because I'm a full-time reservist. So I've been actually in uniform for 42 years now. And until there's a vaccine, it's probably unlikely that I'm going to be traveling for a while. When Ed said to take a look at this, one of the things he thought about mentioning was get people to talk about what was their first game, what was their best game, and what was their worst. That was interesting because it kind of made me think. So I'll be dealing with those in a bit. But one of the first things I want to address before I get into what I want to talk about is the idea of people not wanting to roll dice and Dungeons and Dragons and the geek bit, because I just think you need to attack that head on. Because if somebody doesn't want to roll a dice, then they don't understand risk. And if you don't understand risk, then what on earth are you doing in the military? We had this on a exercise that we were running. And at one point, there was going to be a probability of failure. So a 20-sided dice was produced. It was numbered 1 to 10 twice. It's one of the early percentage dice. And the guy looked at it and he went, "Oh, 20-sided dice. We're playing Dungeons and Dragons, are we?" So the guy involved said, "Actually, this is, based on probabilities. We have a probability of failure. This is a way of representing risk, etc." And then he said, "The other thing is, it's a 20-sided dice. You wouldn't recognize that unless you played Dungeons and Dragons. So shut up, for God's sake." And the other thing is, I was dealing with a couple of guys, very senior in government, and we were at a meeting with a couple of people from the Cabinet Office. It was completely informal. They were turning up. Anyway, two of the girls were late. And one of the chaps said, "Oh, is everything all right? Did you have trouble with traffic?" And the answer was, "No, we're really sorry. Our Dungeons and Dragons session overran." And if it's an excuse that's good enough for the Cabinet Office, then I think it's good enough for the rest of us. So anyway, so what I want to talk about is wargaming professional training. So next slide, please. The most important thing is to understand how do we get better at something, and that's to practice it. There's really good evidence that shows that continuous practice is much better than just natural ability. So the idea, exactly as Ivor said, that this sort of amateur approach to the military profession of we can wing it on the day is absolute rubbish. You need to practice. I mean, there's that old joke about a tourist in New York, and he asks the New Yorker, "How do I get to Carnegie Hall?" And the New Yorker says, "Practice," because New Yorkers are like that and a bit grumpy. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to talk about CAST, Command and Staff Training. This is one of the three main collective training systems we have in the British Army. This is a constructive simulation, so that's a map, and the map has icons on it, and the icons have properties based on the equipment. So as Phil said, this is the capabilities of the unit. Then you would go to CAT, Combined Arms Tactical Trainer, which is a virtual training. And then you would go to live training, which is laser tag for grown-ups. So CAST is the most accessible of our collective training systems for training battle group headquarters. But we only have 3 CAST sites, and we've got 50, 60 units that require training in the British Army. And that's to train at the battle group level, at the brigade level, at the divisional level, and it's even used at headquarters arc level, at the corps level. So as I say on the slides here, steady state training, if you're part of the reaction force, you might get to have a go on it twice in 3 years. If you're like the rest of us in the adaptable force, you're likely to get a go at CAST once in 3 years. Well, my wife sang at Carnegie Hall. She didn't get there by having a bit of a sing-song once in 3 years. There is absolutely no way that that sort of interval is anything remotely like practice. So as far as I'm concerned, and bearing in mind part of my function is to be a bit controversial, as far as I'm concerned, CAST has no value for training. Doesn't mean that it's useless, doesn't mean that we shouldn't have it, because it's extremely good for assessment. But how do we get to the point where we can practice so that when we get to something like CAST, as Ivor said, we understand what we're doing. So, and the reason that we ought to be able to do this is because we need training available in the battle group. Now, I used to work in procurement in Abbey Wood, and I was part of the team that was involved in pushing out the battle group commander control training. And the idea of this was to have a mini CAST within every unit, except cost overruns, delays, and everything else ended up not being able to give one to every unit. And the actual usage of it was very small indeed. And in fact, many units out there will have no idea what I'm talking about, but they will understand the Bowman training suite, because the Bowman training suite, teaching you about Bowman, was actually established with the simulation as well, that people use the simulation so infrequently that most people think it's the Bowman training suite. So how do you get people up to speed? And I would absolutely say that Ivor's right. You should be doing something in your unit, and wargaming is the only way you're going to be able to do it effectively with the money we've got about it. Next slide, please. Wargaming is about people and decisions, and the decisions that they make, and of course the capabilities which Phil mentioned, and of course practicing those decisions. Next slide, please. So when you start looking at it, you should really start simple, as Phil said, and I'm a fan of making it simple military common sense. Now, this photograph here is a photograph of students at Sandhurst doing a very simple free Kriegspiel following a tute. Now, the interesting thing about this was they would go out on the tute and they would make a full estimate for a platoon attack. So they would spend the entire day going through every step of the estimate process. And then at the end of it, they would go back into the classroom, and we probably have 40 minutes or so in which to do a war game, where I would split them in half, and send one half to one end of the room with a simple map and some very simple counters, and the other half to the other end. One team, of course, would represent the enemy, red, and the other team would represent blue. So I would go and speak to the guys representing red, ask them to come up with a plan, and then I'd go back to blue and I'd speak to the person who was in command and say, what is your plan? And they would tell me what their plan is. And my next question was always, is that the same plan you spent the entire day thinking about? And the answer invariably was no. So I would ask, why not? And they would point to the other end of the room and go, well, that's because they know the plan. No, they don't. They've just spent the entire day thinking about it. What you're really saying is, now that you understand that the opposition isn't stupid, you've changed your plan, because what you had before was obvious and was going to be punished by the enemy. So even before we'd started the game, we were getting value from it. And it was very simple. We didn't have to have complicated rules. We just had the old-fashioned, I go, you tell me what you're doing, I go to the other end, explain what people would see realistically, and walk back and forth. Very, very simple. Doesn't require training or anything to understand. Of course, as has previously been said, this isn't carried out anymore because the location of the enemy position was moved on the real ground, and it was just off the map, and nobody could work out how to produce a new map, even though, you know, it's not terribly difficult. You just ask the geo cell to print one for you. The other thing is the counters were very nice and the students tended to steal them. And after the people who were interested in keeping it going had left, there was no institutional memory. So very difficult. Next slide, please. The other thing is, when you're looking at this, it isn't just war fighting. On the left, we've got the Army Medical Services, who designed a game about running the hospital in Afghanistan so that everybody will be able to understand exactly how the hospital works, how it was laid out, and how they would do things before they arrived in theatre. And it was part of a graduated system of training, which started off with a desktop trainer. You then had a slightly larger trainer inside a TA drill hall, and then they had a full life-size mock-up. And the three levels all went together. The one in the middle is counter IED training that is done on the counter IED awareness course at the Defence Academy. This is one that Ed thought up overnight, and I just made it look a bit pretty, and we've been using it on the course to understand counter IED training. And the one on the right is, I've just spent 2 months working with the Department of Health in London against dealing with COVID response and planning the mass testing of Liverpool, which we had a whole day to plan. This is a game about planning mass testing somewhere in the UK. So they don't just have to be war fighting. Use your imagination and make it contemporary and appropriate, and you'll get buy-in from people. Next slide, please. It's also not just paper and counters. Computer games have their place. One of the things it particularly interests me about computer games is that when you are wargaming, you're giving people a problem to solve, and they will be faced with a unique environment that has rules and procedures to go with it. And it is their job to understand that environment and seek out ways of winning and exploit that environment. So to me, if they are using a computer simulation and they work out that they can cheat, if they work out that they can go around the outside, if they work out that if they stand on the top of the truck and jump, they will end up somewhere they couldn't normally get to, that is not cheating. That is exploiting your environment. Cheating is going around the back with your Leatherman and snipping the cable so the other guy's computer dies. You know, one is solving the problem using your imagination within the limitations of the game that we set you, and the other is being stupid. So yes, we can use wargaming in computer simulation, and it works. The picture with all of the cadets was when we were stress testing virtual battle space, which is now called Defense Virtual Simulation. Yeah, we had a lot of fun. Half the room were the bad guys, half the room were good guys, and we saw some genuine planning and initiative being used. And those who actually planned did very well. Whereas the boys who jumped in, convinced that they knew how to play computer games, tended to die quite a lot, which is quite interesting. Next, please. The other thing that I've been involved in a lot in the professional training is at the higher level, the conceptual understanding bit. And this is where we get to actually one of the best war games that I ended up involved in. A government agency in central London asked to run a game about North Korea, the threat from North Korea. This is a matrix game. This is a game about effects and influence. So the rules are very, very simple. There aren't any numbers and measurements. It's based on what do we think is the most likely. We all debate it and come up with a probability of success amongst the group as a whole. This game was very interesting. At the end of it, one of the senior people from the intelligence community was asked what he thought of the game. And he said, it was jolly interesting, it was fun, you know, good bit of team building, but I didn't think the game was realistic. And I said to him, not realistic, but the whole purpose of the game is you say what you want to do, and everyone gets to vote on how realistic it is. And so I'm surprised, you know, what did you find in the game that was the most unrealistic thing? And he said, well, the idea that North Korea and South Korea would get together over the Olympics, that will never happen. And 4 months later, North Korea and South Korea put in a joint Olympic team. And I got a phone call saying, oh my God, everything that we talked about in the game has happened. So that was quite interesting. But of course, what follows from that is, why are you ringing me? And the answer, of course, was, well, it's fantastic. We'd like to do another one. And I'm going, well, stop a minute. You know, if you're in the intelligence community and you're coming to me, that means you think I'm the only guy who can run this. And that's quite wrong. You know, it's jolly nice, flattering to be asked, but you should be running this yourself, because you need to be able to do these sorts of things at short notice in order to get those insights. It wasn't me that produced the insights where everything in the game happened. It was because you got the right people there and the right insights emerged from the game. What you should be doing is establishing your own person to do it. And that's what they did. They sent someone to follow me around for 6 months. And at the end of that, they have their own expert on how to run games like this, which is exactly how it should be, even if I get invited to those sorts of things slightly less afterwards. Although there are some compensations. The picture on the left is a game I was asked to explain and run for the Asia Pacific Institute for Security Studies in Hawaii. So yes, all of the chaps sitting in their Hawaiian shirts are very senior officers, and there's me explaining how to run a game there. Next. So some of the insights that have come in my years of looking at this from a training curriculum is that the game you design doesn't have to be perfect. I have to be slightly careful. When you're looking at this for education, sometimes it's better to have something wrong with the game, so that when you play the game, you can say to the people afterwards, you know, how was that? What did you think? What was wrong with it? And then people will say, well, it was a good game, but I don't think this factor is right. I don't think this is right, or whatever. And as a result, you get greater engagement because they are pointing out what's wrong. Whereas if it's perfect, people tend to shrug, that was good, and move on, as opposed to getting into the mindset where you can adjust the game to match your professional working environment, which is really important. Now, the game has to be oppositional. If you're not playing against a real person, then you're not going to get the best value out of it. As was mentioned earlier, the game doesn't have to be fair. You know, life isn't fair. It shouldn't be fair. If you end up in a fair fight, then your planning is all wrong. It may be balanced, exactly as Phil has said, but you know, you can give people situations where they are badly outnumbered and see how they will deal with it. A game should involve surprise at some stage. You will be surprised in real war. So training people to in an environment where nothing comes up that isn't predictable is an awful way of doing training. The game must also involve failure. The Israelis have a very interesting idea about military training, in that if the exercise you've given someone, if the people taking part don't fail at least half the time, then the training isn't hard enough. They're not going to learn. You either win or you learn. So they have to be able to understand failure and to be able to cope with it. The other thing, it's a little bit more difficult to explain, is that the game shouldn't be repetitive. Now, we need to practice, but the practice is in being flexible, understanding the environment, making the correct deductions about that environment, and then being able to produce a plan that will exploit that. If, when you're playing computer games, you do the same game over and over and over again until you get into a position where you're the expert, all you're doing is optimizing your performance to that particular game, so that when you move into another environment, you will be lost. And what we want people to do is to be flexible. So absolutely, we want to practice decision making. We want to do the analysis, as Ivor has said, but we want to do it in as many different environments as we can, so that we are generating people who are flexible and able to deal with the problems. It's not about the individual game, it's about the people and decision. Lots of people come to me and say, right, what games should I use? And the answer is, well, you can use lots of games, but whatever you do, don't just use one. You know, use different games. Okay, next. Okay, I want to finish up with one of my worst games. This is when I went off and did a war game for the Royal Marines, and it was about a service-protected evacuation in Beirut. Proper operation that they might be given, but they I ran it as a normal Kriegspiel, as I would. So simple, 2 maps, me walking between the two, very informal, and no real detailed rules, etc. At the end of the game, the guy who organized it came up to me and said, yeah, that was fine, thank you very much. He said, but it really wasn't, we didn't have a clear idea about time. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's really essential in the Marines when we're dealing with ship to shore and coordination and synchronization of effects, that we have a clear understanding of how time is progressing within the game. And in the simple games that I'd done at Sandhurst, that hadn't really come up. But of course, at this level, when they were doing this evacuation, it was far more important. So I went out and I bought a clock. And then I looked at one of the earliest pictures of how Kriegspiels were done. And I sat there and I suddenly realized in the back of the picture, there is a bloody great clock to coordinate the timing between all the players. And I just facepalmed thinking to myself, you know, how could I have missed something so obvious? So it's quite often a really good idea just to look at how people did it in the past, because simple solutions can help out enormously. Okay, I think that's me. Question.
Thanks, Tom. As ever, very detailed and thorough. So I'm going to pick one question for yourself, and then we're going to go to bring the rest of the panelists back in, and we'll do the consolidated Q&A. So I'm going to pick the latest question shown there. So from your experience, what factors drive the use or non-use of wargaming outcomes for institutional learning?
It's entirely down to personal relationships and understanding. So if you've got someone who wants to try to do something different, if you've got someone open-minded, then they will be willing to give it a go. However, they are terrified about it failing or not working. So it's fine. You know, I get asked to do those. I've done lots of them, and it's fine when I do it. But of course, I can't do it all the time. So you get a lot of people who are less confident in an environment where to be seen to fail is a disaster. So it's difficult. So what you need to do is to be able to say, look, we're going to use this as a vehicle to get greater engagement and greater understanding, as opposed to endless Zoom lectures like this one. And we want to encourage that. So let's do more of it so that we can advance the ones that work and discard the ones that don't, rather than tarring everything with the same brush. Yes, I played a war game once, it didn't work. It's a ridiculous idea. There are so many different types of game. So you need to be able to establish that personal relationship. You need to understand what the game is trying to deliver, and then you need to give it a go and improve it to match what you're trying to teach.
Great, thanks, Tom. So I'm now going to invite Alex on to moderate the Q&A. Could I ask all the panelists to put on their video and unmute? And Alex is going to read. Is going to invite someone to read out a question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would like to first of all thanks say thank you to all the speakers. Really insightful and a lot of good questions. And I think I would like to start with the one that's the second on the screen. And apologies for if I mispronounce it, but it's Vishalyi Odedra. Sorry. Because that question was specifically asked to Ivor, but I think it's a question that would be asked to all of the panelists, because it's a current topic and it's about unconventional warfare. So you mentioned, Ivor, the ASL and the Camberley Kriegspiel, both well-respected games. Have you viewed or reread The Insurgent Uprising, an unconventional war game, or any other unconventional warfare war game?
No, and thanks for the steer, Vishalji, if I've pronounced that correctly. I don't know this one. I have tried some of the coin, you know, great GMT's coin series, and I think there's some really outstanding insights that come out of some of those. For example, A Distant Plane, the one in Afghanistan. You know, before we used to deploy to Afghanistan, there would be more literature thrown at you to read to try and help develop your understanding than you ever had time to actually read. I found actually if you took people aside and you immersed them in a bit of a distant plane, playing the 4 different factions involved, you end up with a better read into the situation in Afghanistan and some of the nuances of what goes on in there and the political issues than you did with all the copious reading that we were given. So I think, it's probably really difficult, and Phil would probably be a better place to answer this, and Tom, than I am. I will look this up because it sounds really interesting. The closest I've got to finding something that's more typically wargame focused than the Coin series has been Next War Poland, which has got a fair bit of unconventional warfare factored into it. But I'm not familiar enough with that yet either. So probably not a satisfactory question, and better answered by the other two. Sorry, not a satisfactory answer to a good question.
Thanks. Tom, do you have any experience with this game or any sort of likewise games?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the game. I was at Connections USA when I saw a presentation. It's more of a rigid set of rules, and I personally, that doesn't appeal to me when we're dealing with insurgency, because of course insurgency deals so much with effects and influence amongst the population. But I've used a number of Matrix games. One of the most interesting games that I was involved in was with Peter Perler very early on. I had no idea who was taking part in the game, but we had Ed McGrady, Peter Perler, Stephen Downes Martin, and other great luminaries of the gaming groups in the United States, the professional wargaming. And that was about a 6-month tour in Afghanistan. And Matrix games offer a huge opportunity to examine things that are very difficult to measure, like effects and influence. People seem to think that computers are going to solve their problems, and that AI and machine learning is also going to help. And I would say it can help, but it's never going to give you what you think it can give. It should be able to fix some of the more stupid errors, but no. So yes, unconventional warfare. If you can't come up with a game that represents unconventional warfare, then go home. I mean, what's the point? It's far more likely than Space Invaders on the Rhine nowadays. So if you haven't got a game that you can reach for in your armory, then you really need to do your homework.
Thank you, Tom. Phil, do you have an example of an unconventional warfare war game?
There's lots of them. I don't know this particular one, but there's a lot of them. Let me just give you an illustration of how very simply and quickly and easily you could model the classic guerrilla situation. Massive counterinsurgent forces, just a few guerrillas. What's the guerrilla advantage? Their intelligence, that they're hard to find, but they can target, because they have very good intelligence themselves, wherever they can strike against the enemy weaknesses. How can you model that in a game? Very simply, you allow the you have the counterinsurgent forces to move. The guerrilla forces see where they're moving, and then the few guerrillas can move. They can escape, or they can concentrate against the places that the counterinsurgents have left vulnerable. You see, so they're a very asymmetric situation, balanced by asymmetric intelligence rules. Now, the first thing you need to do is to understand the mechanics of the situation. How can a handful of guerrillas win against a vast conventional force? That's one of the key aspects, and you can play that in a game. Then you can start to tweak the rules and so on and so forth. So it's possible to design games on guerrilla warfare. Many people have done it, and I think it's really important that people take advantage of those sorts of simple tricks to be able to understand asymmetric warfare.
Thank you, Phil. And conscious of time, it's running through our fingers. So I would like, although I would like to ask more questions, but I think we have time for one, and I would like to ask Arnel if you want to ask the question yourself, and I'll will unmute you. If you would like to ask the question about the most memorable wargaming experience.
Hey, thanks, Alex, and all the speakers and presenters. Very informative and instructive here. As we drink and celebrate Thanksgiving, is rather good close to the night here. So I'm very grateful for the ability to learn more from you guys. So just a simple question, just from all your games that you've played, and I'm sure you've all played many. What's your most memorable wargaming experience in which game? Just that rather really simple question. Thank you so much.
Ivor, you first.
I'll talk about the most memorable one from. So this was less about enjoyment, more from a professional perspective. I was based out in the States for a while, working in a headquarters, and they used to run war games there. I was impressed by how much more involved in active wargaming the US military was than we were. But this was a game that involved all intelligence agencies in the US, a couple of really heavy-hitting headquarters, and it went into a deep dive looking at a trans-regional terrorist scenario situation. So why was this a groundbreaking moment for me? I realized the importance that you can get from the right type of war game run by the right people, at doing everything, influencing all the way up to Department of State and Department of Defense, strategic planning and engagement with multinational partners on the basis of readouts that you're getting from a war game.
Thank you. Tom, very briefly.
Right. Yeah. One of the most memorable wargaming experience for me was I was working at the Defense Academy, and I was told that I was going to be the cyber guy. This was a few years ago, before cyber was really a big deal. And I was like, why on earth me? And it's like, well, you deal with you're the DS for simulation. That involves computers. So with military logic, the simulation guy was the cyber expert. So I ended up 6 months later having published a book on games for cyber education, and ended up on a committee advising government ministers on the Olympics. No one could have been more surprised than me. But I ended up playing a game called the DSTL Cyber Game. Yeah, a really snappy title. You can investigate it. And at the end of it, it was a revelation. It was absolutely brilliantly designed. It got the information across. And I remember playing the game with some guys from the cabinet office, and one of them halfway through went, "Oh my God, we shouldn't be playing this game. It'll give people ideas." And it's like, too late, chum. So yeah, that was a fantastic experience and a genius bit of design.
Thank you, Tom. And Phil, your last words and your most memorable game.
Thinking about this, I'd have to go back to when I was young, and it was one of my first competition war games, and it shows what you can get as a player to this. The enemy had launched an attack. I'd put half my forces to hold them. I'd sent the other half round a wood. I thought I was the best general in the world. I was like Hannibal, you know, I was going to, and it was all going to be absolutely marvelous. And that's when I learned about friction. I learned far more about friction through that game than I learned from reading Clausewitz. The force got delayed going round the wood. There were some small enemy forces that managed to hold them up. Meanwhile, the enemy were pressing my main line. In the end, they broke through. Their simple plan beat my complex plan. That's the kind of thing that wargaming can give you, okay? Otherwise, people will try to be too clever for their own good. War games can actually show you the balance between doing the simple thing and doing the clever thing. It's an absolutely searing experience. I will never forget it. Literally, we are going back nearly 50 years.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So yeah, like I said, time is running very quickly tonight, and I wish we had more time. But before I hand over the phone to the microphone to Ed, I would take this opportunity to say a very big thanks to the three presenters from a completely different background with a completely different experiences. Ivor, Tom, Phil, thanks, and I hope to speak to you soon, both virtually, but most preferably, of course, with a pint or at least in real life. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I have control. So if you wish to reach out and contact the panelists, they have agreed to be available. Please use the email addresses shown on the screen. These will be circulated later along with the slides and the video. Just bear in mind they have other things going on, so if you do want to get hold of them, they may take a short time in responding. If you want some wargaming resources, then again, when you get the slide deck, everything shown on this screen is hyperlinked. Connections UK is probably the prime starting point, and specifically the Introduction to Wargaming primer shown there on the screen. I recommend Phil's book, and he hasn't paid me to say that. If you want the Camden Kriegspiel, it's available on AKX official site on the link up there. PackSims, run by Rex Bryan, is also a fantastic resource, sort of looking at gaming and its effects on the real world. And wouldn't be right without a small amount of geekery. The Board Game Geek website has a huge repository of board games. If you want to look at a commercial off the shelf to get into the topic, or to use for some purpose, then go there, read reviews. You might even be able to get a print and play version for free. So that concludes the webinar. I'm just going to do some of our parish notices. Not next week. I'm taking a bit of a pause between webinars so I can set this one up. 10th of December, this will be the last in the 2020 webinar series on tactical psychology with Dermot Rooney. Not associated directly with wargaming, but something we should all consider in terms of the human and moral factors that should influence wargame design. So if you're interested in that, please sign up when the Twitter link is posted. As mentioned in the last webinar, this is us introducing Operation Thunderclap, Fight Club's inaugural live event in Portsdown West in January next year. Only available to members of Fight Club already. If you are interested, please register your interest on Slack. A nod back to my old university, King's College London Wargaming Network is hosting a webinar on the 7th of December on the epistemology of wargaming. This isn't linked, but you can find it online just by searching KCL Wargaming Network. And lastly, if you have enjoyed what you've heard tonight and you want to find out more and get involved, then please do join the fight. Go to our Twitter handle and you can find a link there, which will take you to a form. Fill that in and we will respond to you normally within the working week. That's it from me and from the panel. Thank you very much.